Today I bring you three stories that challenge our understanding of the universe. A blind God who awakens to find himself completely alone, a sky that comes alive and devours an entire city, and mysterious black-eyed beings that stalk a family for generations. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more cosmic horror stories like these and more information about our space. The Pandora Incident. On April 17, 1991, an inexplicable event catalogued as a supernatural abomination occurred in a small Canadian town, which was assigned the codename Pandora to conceal its true name and location. This event lasted from the early morning of April 17th until the 18th of the same month. The event began with the formation of a sinister, yellowish-brown cloud that appeared in the sky slowly and progressively. Upon closer inspection, the cloud appeared to have long, fleshy, and motionless extremities. Veins also appeared in the clouds. The clouds almost seemed to be made of putrefying flesh that, according to incident survivors, had such a fetid stench that it forced spectators to seek refuge inside their homes. The sky's transformation caused panic among residents, leading to emergency lines being flooded with calls about the incident. At 1:59 p.m., television stations within 5 kilometers of Pandora activated the National Emergency Alert System, urging people to remain inside their homes and avoid being outdoors without reason. At 2:30 p.m., there were reports of what appeared to be eggs falling from the sky. These eggs, upon touching the ground, began to spread the same biomass that composed the cloud. The same sickly, rotten flesh that spread almost like tendrils, consuming anything within a 10 to 20 meter radius. Unfortunately, many people ignored the warning and left their houses to witness the phenomenon, causing them to contract a parasitic disease caused by contact with the eggs falling from the sky. L5 was a parasitic disease caused by the thing in the sky. Upon contracting the disease, individuals would immediately experience the growth of additional eyes and other grotesque extremities in random areas of the body, while countless holes appeared throughout their skin, which expelled an unidentifiable liquid. As the disease consumed the subject and destroyed them beyond their human form, they became a parasitic instance of the cloud that would eventually attack uninfected humans or animals, until ending their lives. Once this occurred, the lifeless bodies of individuals or animals were integrated into the sky through some tremendously long organ type that appeared to be like a tube, and that sucked up the remains to help with the sky's parasitic growth. The biomass itself would also turn into the same rotten, repugnant brown flesh that composed the clouds and sky. At this point, as several Pandora residents were infected with the strange disease and the grotesque veins growing in the sky seemed to become even larger and more putrid, the government declared a state of emergency and the area was cordoned off. Observers reported that the sky's organic form seemed to extend beyond Pandora City, which created great concern for neighboring cities that could have suffered the same fate as Pandora. By this time, a strange flower-like formation was growing in the center of the cloud. This formation was horrible. The growth appeared to have a mouth with shapeless teeth and gray eyes. According to the words of a local police officer, it was something out of a Lovecraftian nightmare and will undoubtedly leave a scar on this place forever. Finally, at 2:51 a.m., the Canadian government secretly approved the order to attempt to destroy the living sky over Pandora City with a nuclear bomb. Given that Canada didn't have weapons of that type at the time, the Canadian government requested help from the U.S. government. No evacuation order was given, and an hour later, the living sky over Pandora was destroyed with a nuclear attack that destroyed the biomass. Much of the devastation caused by the explosion was absorbed by the cloud, causing minimal effects on Pandora City and its population. There were barely any reports of radiation damage. Radiation wasn't a problem for the inhabitants. What they really had to worry about was having to live their entire lives with the memories of what they saw in the sky those nights. The horror of watching the sky come alive. The black-eyed beings. I'm going to tell you a story that is surprisingly true. My mother told it to me, and she swears up and down that this happened. My father, aunt, grandmother, and grandfather can also vouch for it because they were present during some of the events. You can choose to believe my words. It's your decision. Now let's begin. When I was born almost 20 years ago, my mother was in the hospital for 4 days. She had to recover and wait until I could go home since I had been born 2 months early. Sitting in her hospital bed, reading a newspaper and drinking tea, the door opened. A nurse she had never seen before entered and stood beside her. My mother had been watching her curiously. The nurse hadn't said anything the entire time, but just kept staring at my mother's stomach. After some uncomfortable seconds, my mom asked this nurse what was going on. The nurse seemed surprised and frightened as she looked at my mother with her almost coal-black eyes. "Can you see me?" asked the nurse, and my mother gave her a strange look before the nurse quickly left the room. Moments later, the nurse who had been with my mother during delivery entered. She asked about the mysterious nurse, only to learn that there were only 3 nurses on duty, and none matched the description of the mysterious nurse who had entered. That was the first strange thing that happened, but not the last. A few months later, probably a year, my mother and grandmother had taken me for a quiet walk in the park near the apartment buildings where we lived. Stopping to rest, 2 individuals approached, a man and a woman. They kept staring at me the whole time. My mother quickly took me and held me as close as possible to her and didn't stop watching them. The woman had put her hand on the chest of the man who had started walking toward us and stopped him by shaking her head. "It's not time yet," she whispered, before looking my mother in the eyes. My mother told me that both were extremely pale and ghastly in appearance. The only thing she told me that struck her most was the peculiarity in their eyes. They had no irises, just pure darkness. Then the 2 people turned and walked away as if nothing had happened. Quite paranoid and nervous, both my grandmother and mother went straight home. This pattern repeated quite often after that. My mother would constantly see these pale people with nothing but darkness for eyes. Every time she saw them, they would look at her with blank expressions, always giving her a feeling of unease and disquiet. One day, about 5 or 6 years later, we were all inside a church looking at clothes and toys they had prepared for a charity garage sale. I had been standing with my aunt looking at some toys, and my mother and father were on the other side talking with some people they knew. One of the dark-eyed people entered the church and headed straight to where I was standing. My aunt didn't notice this, but my mother, who had been watching me, did. She literally pushed people out of the way and ran toward me, taking me in her arms while the dark-eyed man stopped halfway. They basically stood there staring at each other. Many people were looking strangely at my mother, and that's when my mother realized that not everyone could see these people, these creatures. That being did something that sent chills down my mother's spine. Her whole body went cold with unease. With a slow and evil smile, he leaned toward my mother, looking directly into her eyes, and spoke. "Time is running," he whispered in the calmest voice. Then he simply vanished. At this point, my entire family was scared. We ended up moving from the city to a very small town of 20 to 40 inhabitants. Living there for a year, we moved once more to a larger city of about 1,000 inhabitants. We've been living here for almost 14 years. My mother had told me this story many times, always warning me to avoid anyone who matched the description of the things that had been pursuing us. I've only seen one, and my mother was with me. We had been in a small town an hour away doing some shopping when one turned the corner of an aisle we were in. He continued walking with a smile on his face as he passed by us. I had never seen my mother move as fast as she did that time. We left that store in seconds. We still haven't seen any of these dark-eyed humanoids in our city. The day we find these things in our town is when we'll know our time is up. For what? We don't know. We don't know what they want. That's what's terrifying. But there's one thing we'll always repeat in our minds. One thing they keep repeating. Time never stops. The Awakening of the Blind God. A violent tremor echoed throughout the cosmos, shaking it to its foundations. Stars groaned in anguish and extinguished one after another, screaming an unbearable melody as they drowned in their own blood and convulsed in agony. The sun was consumed in pure darkness. The planets in our solar system grew colder than even Antarctica's climate. The gaseous bodies turned into solid blocks of ice that bounced from their orbits and collided with each other. Mars was launched on a destructive path toward our Earth. The force exerted on the planet caused an alteration in its rotation, tilting it off its axis. Many panicked at the sensation that the universe itself had vanished. There was great distress throughout Earth that had never been heard in the planet's long existence and would never be heard again. The Earth itself opened up to devour everything in its path. Houses were swallowed while some slept deeply, ignorant of what was happening. Tsunamis rose in great storms along the beaches. The moon was deeply immersed in a red tone. Blood dripped from the moon as if the moon itself were crying. At the 13th hour, demonic flutes resonated in the air. Great balls of fire descended from the sky to consume any remaining survivors. The world's fresh water turned to boiling blood that poisoned the living creatures within it. The fabric of reality tore, sending plagues of flying fungoid crustaceans that latched onto the unfortunate and drove them to absolute madness. The demonic flutes sang their final note before drowning in a low murmur. Tentacled beings escaped through the tear in reality, forcing some to faint. They possessed masses of appendages with tentacles and toothed suckers and eyes that manifested in every orifice of their bodies. The universe gave its final breath and disappeared into vast nothingness, absolutely devoid of life. And so, the blind god awoke from his eon-long sleep, unable to comprehend that he was now the only being that existed. If these stories about ancient gods, living skies, and mysterious entities disturbed you, I invite you to explore another equally unsettling mystery in my video, What Caused the Mist Events? Discover how a military experiment unleashed interdimensional horrors that forever changed the life of a small town. Like our protagonists today, we'll never know when the reality we know might crumble. See you in the next video, knowledge seekers.